During the summer of 1863, the U.S. government sent the legendary Kit Carson to deal with the Navajo. As such, the former mountain man adopted a scorched earth policy, burning crops and villages, restricting access to water, and pretty much annihilating everything he could find that belonged to the Navajo. What resulted is an especially dark chapter in American history known as the Long Walk, as thousands of refugees were marched from their homeland and forced to live in conditions more akin to a concentration camp than a reservation. But who were the Navajo? How much of a role did Kit Carson truly play in the Long Walk? Why'd he get involved in the first place? And how did the Navajo fare once they found themselves on the Bosque Redondo? My name's Josh, and this is the Wild West Extravaganza. The Dene, or Navajo as they're more commonly known, began migrating south around 1,000 years ago, eventually laying claim to a massive swath of land from present-day New Mexico all the way west into Arizona. Initially hunter-gatherers, the Dene quickly adapted to farming as well as raising livestock. Sheep especially would play a very important role to their way of life, not only as a source of food, but also wool, which they'd use to weave their famous Navajo blankets. The Dene were also a warrior society, and much like other tribes there in the Southwest, they would often clash with the Spanish and the Mexicans, and in time, even the Americans. And partly this was just self-preservation. The Europeans not only wanted their land, but they also wanted to change who the Navajo were as a people. The Spanish missionaries would even go so far as to chain captives to church pews. At least they did until 1672, when a delegation of Navajo pulled a priest straight out the chapel, stripped him naked, and bashed his head in with a bell. Needless to say, over the course of the next century or so, efforts to convert the Dene were pretty much abandoned altogether. And the violence continued. The Navajo would strike hard and fast, killing a shepherd or two, kidnapping a few women and children, and then fleeing with as much livestock as they could handle. People were killed, prisoners were taken, but generally speaking, these raids were mostly centered around animals, especially sheep. I cannot stress that enough. Sheep really were the wealth of the Navajo. Pretty much the only chance that a young man had in gaining influence amongst his people was to build a respectable flock, hence the frequent raids on the settlements. It wasn't all about sheep, though, unfortunately. As I just mentioned, the Navajo would oftentimes also take prisoners, some of whom were adopted into the tribe, some used as slave labor, and others simply sold at a profit. At least one source I found estimated that slaves owned by the Navajo in just New Mexico alone made up around 10% of the territory's population. In other words, quite a few families were torn apart thanks to Navajo depredations. Don't get it twisted, though, because this did go both ways. The Ute, Apaches, Mexicans, and even the Americans would also enslave the Navajo, regardless of laws making the practice illegal. Hell, in Taos, there were slave auctions held in the town plaza where Native American children were sold for as little as $40 a head. As I'm sure you can imagine, this led to even more violence, and the Navajo just kept on raiding. Attempts were made throughout the years by the military to keep the Dene in check, but this proved mostly ineffectual, partly due to just how numerous the Navajo were. Even nowadays, they remain the largest tribe in the United States with around 400,000 enrolled members. Weren't quite as many back in 1860, but a decent guesstimate puts their population, at that time, at around 12,000, which meant they still far outnumbered other tribes, especially down in New Mexico and Arizona. Just to put things into perspective, the Mescalero Apache, who Kit Carson had recently defeated and relocated to a reservation, only numbered a few hundred. Also, you gotta take into account the land of the Navajo, especially their maze-like stronghold in Arizona known as Canyon de Chelly. With sheer walls towering hundreds of feet high and a labyrinth of box canyons, this holy land of the Navajo had thus far proved insurmountable. Matter of fact, when Colonel Dixon Miles scouted a portion of the canyon back in 1858, he'd ominously remarked that no command should ever again enter it. Even the great Kit Carson, upon first laying eyes on the canyon, would describe it as stupendous and impregnable. So suffice it to say, bringing the mighty Navajo nation to its knees weren't going to be no small undertaking. Now, just to bring us back to our current timeline, New Mexico wouldn't officially become a territory of the United States until 1850. But it had been under U.S. protection since General Kearny seized control in 1846. thus inheriting the quote-unquote Navajo problem from the Mexicans. Hostilities increased in 1849 following the killing of a respected Dene leader, Narbonne, and from there things just progressively grew worse. Over the next 2 decades, a series of treaties were signed and broken, and the violence would only escalate, especially once the Civil War began and frontier posts were left abandoned. Much like the Comanche over in Texas, I guess the Navajo felt like they had carte blanche to go on the warpath when and where they pleased. There just weren't enough soldiers to stop them. Now, during just the year 1862, it's thought that the Navajo were responsible for $250,000 in property loss, not to mention the taking of nearly 300 lives and thousands of sheep. To quote historian Hampton Sides, all across New Mexico, the threat of Navajo raiders gave life an undertow of anxiety. The settlers dwelled in a state of vigilance, always half listening, scanning the sagebrush for movement. Everyone knew some family whose child or mother had been carried off. In the foothills, cairns often studded the pastures. Decorated with crosses or flowers, these markers memorialized shepherds who had been cut down. At a very young age, New Mexicans learned to hate and fear the word Navajo. End quote. But in the words of the late great Sam Cooke, change gon' come. And that change came in the form of Brigadier General James Henry Carleton. You see, in August 1862, Carleton was made military commander over the Department of New Mexico. And once he was done mopping up the Confederates, he set his sights on the Navajo. Now, just a quick side note, but before arriving in New Mexico, General Carleton had been stationed at Fort Tejon over in California, just north of the Sebastian Indian Reservation. Also known as Tejon Farm, this reservation was loosely based on the Spanish mission system, and by the year 1854, it was said to have been home to around 2,500 natives. They were taught how to farm, how to dig irrigation ditches, how to raise cattle and sheep, build homes, all that kind of stuff. And by some accounts, many of the California indigenous did adjust well to life at Tejon Farm, at least initially. Sadly, as tends to be the case, things did not go as planned. There was a series of droughts, the crops were ravaged by disease, local settlers resented the land being set aside for the natives, and ultimately, Tejon Farm proved to be an abject failure. But not before it inspired General Carleton to try something similar in New Mexico. Basically, Carleton's plan was to pacify the natives and turn them all into good little Christian farmers. Per the general himself, quote, "The only peace that can ever be made with them, the Navajo, must rest on the basis that they move on to the lands at Bosque Redondo and, like the Pueblos, become an agricultural people and cease to be nomads. Entire subjugation or destruction are the alternatives." So yeah, basically you got 2 choices. Give up your entire way of life and go live on some good-for-nothing piece of land far from home, or face extermination. Hell, Carleton even had the land in question already picked out. A spot in eastern New Mexico along the Pecos that you heard me mention a moment ago, the Bosque Redondo. That's where Fort Sumner was constructed during the fall of 1862, and once completed, Carleton decided to test it out on the Apaches. We discussed this prior in the series, but after a relatively short campaign, the general's attack dog, our very own famed frontiersman Kit Carson, was successful in persuading the Mescaleros to settle at the Bosque. The Navajo would prove just a tad bit more difficult. Like I said earlier, there was around 12,000 of them, or roughly 24 times as many Navajos as there were Mescalero Apache. Also, like I said earlier, their stronghold, Canyon de Chelly, was far to the west, over 400 miles from the reservation. And just an FYI, this is also something we discussed earlier, but it bears repeating. Kit Carson did not want to go after the Navajo. He joined the army to help defend New Mexico against the Confederates, and once that was taken care of, he stuck around long enough to pacify the Mescaleros, but the Navajo were a whole nother story. Kit, who by this point was already 53 years old, just wanted to go home and be with his family. He ended up sending Carleton a letter of resignation, which the general denied. So in other words, like it or not, Carson was going to have to head to Canyon de Chelly and battle it out with the Navajo on their own home turf. Now the campaign officially began during the summer of 1863. Carson had close to 1,000 men under his command, a mix of U.S. Army officers, New Mexican volunteers, and even a smattering of Pueblo and Ute scouts. Is it Pueblo or Pueblo, by the way? I got accused of being AI again recently because somebody didn't like the way I said Pueblo. Pueblo, potato, I don't know. I'll look into it. Today's episode of the Wild West Extravaganza is brought to you by BetterHelp. You know, there's a good chance if you're listening to me talk, then you enjoy learning about history, or hopefully learning in general. That's something I see a lot of in my daughter. She just turned 3, and she absolutely loves learning new things, like a little sponge. But what about you? You still got that childhood sense of wonder and a love for learning new things? Anything new you've thought about picking up in your spare time? Gardening, maybe? A new language? How to start a podcast? Well, I'm here to tell you that therapy can help you reconnect with your sense of wonder. Because let's face it, your back-to-school era can happen at any time, no matter your age. Whether you're looking to learn positive coping skills or even how to set boundaries, a nice talk with a licensed therapist can empower you to be the best version of yourself. And no, therapy is not just for those who've experienced major trauma. With that in mind, if you're thinking about starting therapy, and you probably should be thinking about it, why not give BetterHelp a try? It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited for your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and switch therapist anytime for no additional charge. So come on, rediscover curiosity with BetterHelp. Visit betterhelp.com/wildwest to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP as in papa.com/wildwest. Today's episode is also brought to you by the good folks at Manscaped. Look, right now is the best time of the year. Pretty soon it'll start to cool off, and you know what that means. Football is back. We're talking NFL Sundays, college football Saturdays, and that glorious grind of fantasy football lineups. This is when your inner GM comes alive, setting the perfect fantasy roster and making last-minute waiver moves that'll either make you a hero or the guy that everybody ridicules in the group chat. But listen, while you're over there making sure that your fantasy team is dialed in, don't let your personal grooming become the guy that gets left on the bench. Because let's be honest, nobody wants to fumble their grooming routine. That's where the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra from Manscaped comes in, acting as your all-in-one grooming playbook. From keeping things sharp down below with the Lawnmower 5.0 Ultra to taking care of those rogue nose and ear hairs with the Weed Whacker 2.0. This is the lineup that'll keep you looking and feeling like a champ. And maybe you don't even play fantasy football. It doesn't matter. Halloween's right around the corner. So shave you a little jack-o'-lantern in that man muff of yours and find out the true meaning of trick or treat. Manscaped even has you covered with a little ball aftercare to give those most valuable players of yours some TLC. The Crop Soother Ball Aftershave Lotion and Crop Preserver Anti-Chafing Ball Deodorant make sure that you stay fresh and comfortable through every quarter of your day. And the Performance Package 5.0 Ultra doesn't just stop at grooming. It also comes with 2 free gifts: the Boxers 2.0 Midnight Bravo and the Shed 2.0 Toiletry Bag. So what are you waiting for? Join the over 10 million men worldwide who trust Manscaped and get ready for kickoff by heading over to manscaped.com. Use the code WILDWEST for 20% off plus free shipping. That's manscaped.com, code WILDWEST for 20% off and free shipping. Trust me, with Manscaped, you'll be drafting the real MVP of grooming this season. Let's get back to the story. By early July, Kit's column was already in the land of the Navajo and setting up shop at the abandoned Fort Defiance, which Carson renamed Fort Canby. Now, as it turns out, just 6 months prior, General Carleton sent word to the Navajo that they were to surrender to Carson right there at Fort Canby by July 20th, or else. I believe his exact words were that after that day, every Navajo would be considered hostile and treated accordingly. That after that day, the door that was now open would be closed. Well, July 20th came and went without notice, and sure enough, Carleton gave Kit the go-ahead to proceed with the invasion. The official orders from the general were as follows. For a long time past, the Navajo Indians have murdered and robbed the people of New Mexico. It is therefore ordered that Colonel Christopher Carson, with a proper military force, proceed without delay to the Navajo country and there to prosecute a vigorous war upon the men of this tribe. End quote, and prosecute it Carson would. To once again paraphrase Hampton Sides, there was nothing glorious about Carson's campaign. No great engagements, no fields of honor, and no decisive victories. With the American invasion, the Navajos did what they had always done. They scattered, vanished, dropped into their 1,000 pockets and holes, and abided in silence. And so, with no one to fight, Carson's campaign became, of necessity, a war of grinding attrition. The pressure he applied through the summer and fall of 1863 was incremental, cumulative, merciless, and without relent. The goal, pure in its simplicity, was to make the Navajo feel the bitter burn of starvation, on the theory that hunger alone could bring them to accept conditions that they otherwise would not entertain. Carson never used the term scorched earth, but that's what it was, the first systematic use of it in the West, and more than a year before Sherman's march across the South. If there was ever a grandeur or majesty to warfare, surely none could be found here. And yeah, I do think that's a great summary of this particular campaign. With the Navajo going into hiding and pretty much refusing to fight, Kit instead focused his efforts on just starving them out. When he and his men located Dene crops, they burnt them. And when they located their horses, they shot them, likewise with the sheep. Pretty much everything they could find belonging to the Navajo was destroyed. Pottery, baskets, everything. And on the rare occasions that they encountered Navajo warriors, they too were destroyed. All total, Carson ended up burning thousands of acres of crops. Excuse me. Let's try that again. All total, Carson ended up burning thousands of acres of crops and an estimated nearly 2 million pounds of food. Even had his Ute scouts stand guard over the watering holes to deprive the Navajo from even so much as quenching their thirst. And as heartless as this strategy was, it did work. Wasn't long before a small band of Navajo, numbering somewhere between 75 to 100 souls, sent emissaries to Fort Canby pleading for peace. The only problem was Carson was gone when they arrived. In his stead, a Major Thomas Blakeney ended up arresting the would-be peace commissioners and treating them poorly. At least one of them was shot dead trying to escape, and by the time Kit showed up, only one remained, an elderly man by the name of Littlefoot. And this must have been frustrating as hell for Carson. He really did believe that if given the chance to speak with the Navajo, he'd have been able to win them over. Figured he could have treated them good enough that they'd talk the other bands into surrendering as well. But instead, Major Blakeney decided to be an asshole. And he certainly wasn't the only one. Remember, this was during the summer of 1863. The Civil War was reaching a fever pitch back east. Hell, the Battle of Gettysburg just went down that July, and, well, I guess a lot of the officers assigned to Carson felt like they were missing out on all the glory. Instead of fighting Johnny Reb and preserving the Republic, they was out in Arizona sweating their asses off and chasing a bunch of Navajo ghosts. And just to give you an idea what Carson was dealing with, nearly half of the officers in his command were either court-martialed or forced to resign, being charged with all manner of offenses, including murder, alcoholism, embezzlement, sexual deviation, desertion, and incompetence. Even Blakeney was dismissed after Carson pursued an investigation. And if that ain't bad enough, Kit's Ute scouts would soon call it quits and return home. Apparently, either Carson or General Carleton had forbidden them from taking Navajo slaves, so they resigned out of protest. As for the aforementioned Mr. Littlefoot, Kit just ended up letting him go. Halfway hoping he'd still bring his people in, but knowing full well he'd likely end up doing the exact opposite and warn them away. Carson would later say of the ordeal, quote, "From all I can learn, these Indians came in with a flag of truce, and I cannot but regret that they were not better received and kept until my arrival. I cannot blame these people for distrusting the good faith of the troops here at the post, from the manner in which their messengers have been received. I deplore it the more as I now only have one way of communicating with them, through the barrels of my rifles." Now, up until now, Canyon de Chelly proper had not yet been breached. Carson and his men were merely patrolling the surrounding countryside and destroying anything they could find belonging to the Navajo, just constantly applying pressure. They went on a month-long scout that August, covering some 500 miles, but other than the destruction of property, all they managed to do was take around a dozen prisoners. There were a few skirmishes, but for the most part the Navajo had seemingly vanished. It's also worth noting that Kit was really filling his years at this point, almost in constant pain due to old injuries and missing his family something fierce. What's more, his wife Josefa was about ready to pop with baby number 6. That being the case, Carson put in for a 2-month leave of absence, but he was once again denied by General Carleton. He basically told Kit to stop asking, but if by some miracle he managed to capture at least 100 Navajo, then maybe he'd consider letting him go home and visit his family. And the only way Carson was going to capture that many Navajo was by invading their stronghold at Canyon de Chelly, something that had yet to be done with any real measure of success, and certainly never attempted in the dead of winter like Carson was planning. But Kit was nothing if not determined. All he wanted to do was get this business over with so he could return to his family. Meanwhile, the Navajo were making preparations of their own. Women busied themselves stockpiling food as the men went to work making arrows and just pretty much getting ready for a long siege, one that would begin in earnest in January of 1864. Hey, real quick, let's talk about something that I recently had the pleasure of trying out for myself. Today's sponsor and America's #1 meal kit, HelloFresh. Look, I'm a pretty busy guy. In addition to this podcast, I also spend a good chunk each day wrangling a rambunctious 3-year-old. And I don't know if you know this about 3-year-olds, but they can be just a tad bit picky when it comes to what they eat. That's where HelloFresh saves the day with their amazing line of kid-friendly family options that'll have even the pickiest of eaters cleaning their plates. And trust me, it ain't just for the kids, okay? With HelloFresh, you get farm-fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered straight to your doorstep. Gone are the days of waiting in line at the grocery store or even at restaurants. No reservation, no problem. Like I said a moment ago, HelloFresh will deliver restaurant-quality meals straight to that pretty little doorstep of yours. All you gotta do is choose your delivery day, open the box, and get to cooking. I recently tried a few of their meals that take just 20 minutes or less to whip up, and I gotta say, they're pretty daggum tasty. My favorite was the peanut butter and cherry Belgium waffles. Absolutely delicious. I also really enjoyed the beef bulgogi lettuce wraps. And trust me, there's a lot more to choose from, especially considering HelloFresh's changing menu of 50, that's 50 recipes to choose from each and every week. There's just no two ways about it. HelloFresh makes it easy to always find something the whole family will love. And for a limited time, kids eat free. Just go to HelloFresh.com/WildWestKids to unlock this exclusive offer. 1 free kids meal per box for 2 months while subscription is active. That's free kids meals just by going to HelloFresh.com/WildWestKids. Your mouth, your stomach, and your kids will thank you. Now, Carson would end up splitting his command into 2 separate units, leading the largest bunch himself towards the western mouth of the canyon. At the same time, Captain Albert Pfeiffer and 100 volunteers were creeping around back to the east side. The plan, cooked up by General Carleton, was to block the canyon on both ends and have the troops meet up in the middle. The hope was that just the mere presence of soldiers invading this sacred stronghold would be enough to convince the Navajo to surrender. By the way, Captain Pfeiffer is an interesting guy in his own right, one of the few capable officers that Carson had at his disposal. A damn drunk, sure, but still very capable. Story goes that back in the day, Pfeiffer and his lady love were bathing in some hot springs near Taos when they got attacked by the Apaches. His wife was killed, and from that day forward, Pfeiffer hunted down the Apache with a wild abandon. Later, when asked if he avenged his wife's death, Pfeiffer was quoted as saying, "They paid for it, yes. They have paid for it well in blood. I fight them day and night everywhere in all seasons." How true that is, I don't know. But as far as the officers serving Carson were concerned, it would be Pfeiffer who had the most luck in engaging with the Navajo. Be that as it may, this invasion into Canyon de Chelly was met with hardship from the get-go. Thanks to a heavy snow, it took them twice as long to reach the mouth of the canyon as they had planned on. And upon reaching the canyon, Kit immediately sent a detachment of around 50 men to intercept a small group of natives attempting to flee. The short battle that ensued saw 11 warriors killed and 4 non-combatants, women and children, taken prisoner. Meanwhile, Pfeiffer and his volunteers had mistakenly entered the wrong canyon, one known as Canyon del Muerto. And I don't know about you, but if I got to go into the wrong canyon, I don't want it to be called the Canyon of Death. It just does not sound like something good's going to come out of that. And just like with Carson, the going was slow as Pfeiffer's men literally had to break trail through the ice and snow with pickaxes. If all that ain't bad enough, Pfeiffer soon realized that they were surrounded. All along the rim of the canyon, Navajo warriors began jumping about, quote, like mountain cats, hollering at me, swearing and cursing, and threatening vengeance on my command in every variety of Spanish that they were capable of mustering. Still, though, Pfeiffer's men were able to capture a handful of half-starved women and children. They also stumbled upon the frozen remains of other Dene who had already died of starvation. Remember, Carson and his men had been destroying their stores of food for the past 5 months. And although they didn't see too much of the Navajo, these tactics were most definitely taking their toll. As Captain Pfeiffer's column pushed deeper into the canyon, they met with even more resistance. Once again, the warriors were exposing themselves up on the ledges, hollering and yelling, throwing rocks, and some even shooting off rifles, just pretty much trying to lure the soldiers into an ambush. As for the troops, they ended up camping out at the base of what's now called Fortress Rock, unaware that there were hundreds of Navajo directly above them. Or at least I guess I should say they were unaware until night came and the warriors began hurling down insults. Now, before everything was all said and done, those taking refuge at the top of Fortress Rock would end up forming a human chain along a dangerous path leading down to a creek. And there, in the midst of the sleeping soldiers, they quietly filled up gourd after gourd with water, passing them back from one person to another and thus replenishing their supply up on top of the rock. Efforts like this allowed around 300 of the Navajo to slip through Carson's grasp altogether. Unfortunately, there were many others who wouldn't be so lucky. By the evening of January 12th, Carson and Pfeiffer had finally linked back up. Believe it or not, Kit himself would never actually enter the canyon, instead just taking it all in from the southern rim. That very same day, a small band of Navajo, numbering around 50, came limping in waving a white flag. They, like many of their brethren, were half-starved and said they would have come in sooner, but were afraid Kit would have them executed. Instead, Carson gave them food and blankets and asked that they go and convince even more of their kinfolk to come out of hiding. Told them to meet him at Fort Canby within a week with as many people as they could find. Now, this kindness aside, Carson knew good and well that his job, and the subsequent destruction of all that the Navajo held dear, was far from complete. Even as he was departing for Fort Canby the following day with a small detachment, he left the remaining troops there at the canyon, as he put it, to prosecute the campaign with vigor. Captain Pfeiffer and another officer, Lieutenant Asa Carey, were to proceed through the main branch of Canyon de Chelly and destroy everything of value they could find, including the Navajos' prized peach orchards. And we're not talking about just a few trees here. There was around 3,000 in total, dating all the way back to the arrival of the Spanish there in the southwest. And although the soldiers found it difficult to destroy the orchards that winter due to all the snow and ice, they would return the following summer and finish the job, either cutting or burning down every single peach tree that they could find. As for the Navajo, by this point, they had pretty much completely lost their will to fight. I guess seeing your women and children starve to death before your very eyes will do that to a person. They began straggling into Fort Canby by late January, just a handful at first and then more and more until finally they began flooding in. By the first week of February, over 800 Navajos surrendered there at the fort. A few weeks later, that number grew to over 2,000, with rumors of another 1,000 or so more on their way. And once again, Carson ensured that these prisoners were treated with all the kindness that Fort Canby could afford, which honestly was not that much. Truth be told, there wasn't near enough food there to feed so many starving people. And for the Navajo, this was really when the misery began. Now, if you'll recall, several months prior, Carlton had promised Kit that he could visit his family if he captured 100 Navajo. Well, now that that quota was met, Carson finally got his wish. He left Fort Canby in February with around 250 prisoners, delivering them to the Rio Grande, where they were then taken the rest of the way to the Bosque Redondo by a military escort. And Kit, well, he just traveled back home to Taos by way of Santa Fe. Matter of fact, it was there in Santa Fe where he was met with a hero's welcome, with citizens lining up on both sides of the plaza celebrating his great triumph over the Navajo Nation. Even General Carlton sang his praises, telling his superiors in Washington that where so many had previously failed, Kit Carson proved victorious. Now that may have been the case, but according to historian Hampton Sides, Carson was in no shape to celebrate this so-called victory, even if he had been inclined to accept it as such. He was nearing exhaustion and in almost constant pain. He didn't know it yet, but there was something growing inside his chest that was slowly killing him. His horse accident years ago in the San Juans had apparently caused the formation of an aneurysm on his aorta, a tiny balloon that was steadily expanding and would prove immediately lethal should it burst. He knew something was not right. As Tom Dunlay described it, an enemy he could neither outwit nor outfight was on his trail. He wanted no more of the Navajo Wars. "The state of my health warns me," Carson wrote, "that I can no longer render my country sufficient service." Now we'll circle back to Kit here in a moment, but meanwhile, the surrender of Navajo were subjected to what's now known as the Long Walk, sort of a western trail of tears as they were marched all the way from Arizona to eastern New Mexico. The grim columns stretched on for miles as the Navajo struggled through the snow, forced to live off nothing but rancid bacon and uncooked flour. To make matters worse, the soldiers, who by the way had been instructed to treat their Navajo wards with Christian kindness, instead began to make life a living hell for them. Rations were withheld, women were used, and the elderly and infirmed were marched damn near to death. Hell, some were simply shot for just not being able to keep up. The soldiers also looked the other way as the defenseless prisoners fell victim to a series of midnight raids conducted by their enemies, both Native American and New Mexican. They'd rush in under the cover of darkness, steal away Navajo women and children, and then disappear back into the shadows. These attacks became so common during the long walk that at least one officer would warn the guards that they must, quote, exercise extreme vigilance or the Indians' children will all be stolen from them and sold, end quote. Sounds like a nightmare, right? And believe it or not, this was only just the beginning. All totaled, throughout the rest of 1864 and on into 1865, nearly 9,000 Navajo would be forced to march east to the Bosque Redondo. At least 500 of them would die along the way, and once they arrived, the death toll would only continue to climb. Initially, things looked promising. The Navajo were put to work digging irrigation ditches, and they even managed to harvest a bumper crop later on that spring. Carson would join them there on the Bosque as reservation superintendent shortly thereafter, and by all accounts, this was a job he was determined to do with both fairness and compassion. But let's face it, Kit Carson weren't no bureaucrat. Once again, per Hampton's sides, Carson, quote, quickly grew to hate this position, chafed at the rules, and seethed at the inefficiency and corruption he saw all around him. He missed his wife Josefa terribly, just as much as he had during the campaign in Navajo country. They were still a world away from each other. The Bosque lay some 200 miles away from their home in Taos. Sitting at his desk, shuffling papers that he could not read, making requests for food and equipment that the financially strapped, war-torn government would seldom honor, he toiled for 3 months in misery. Not since he was a saddle-maker's apprentice had he felt so trapped in a job for which he had no liking or competence. It was, he wrote, not the position that I contemplated occupying, end quote. And yeah, despite claiming to have the best interests of the Navajo at heart, there was still only just so much that one man could do, especially in just 3 months. In addition to dealing with all that corruption and a lack of rations, Carson also had to mediate disputes between the Navajo and their new neighbors, the Mescaleros. No real surprise there, as the two tribes had been longtime enemies even before being settled on the Bosque Redondo. As such, they had to be wrangled by the guards just to stop them from attacking one another. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg. There were a ton of other problems. In time, hundreds of the Navajo would end up catching dysentery due to the water of the Pecos, described by one of the soldiers there at Fort Sumner as terrible, just full of alkali and operated on a person like castor oil. They would even joke that the more you wash yourself, even with soap, the dirtier you would get. And then there was the lack of available firewood. Apparently all the larger trees had been cut down to construct the fort, which forced the Navajo to travel great distances to collect fuel for their fires. Either that or they had to use mesquite or just suffer through the cold. Syphilis, too, became an issue, both for the Navajo and the soldiers, especially once the troops began trading food rations for sexual favors. Girls as young as 12 or 13 were prostituted out just to help feed their families. Finally, you had the Comanche. That's another reason the reservation was placed where it was there on the Bosque Redondo. This way the Navajo and the Mescaleros could serve as a buffer against the lords of the southern plains. And yeah, the Comanche would end up attacking the reservation quite often, making off with women, children, livestock, pretty much anything they could get their hands on. And remember what I said earlier about that bumper crop? Well, it didn't stand much of a chance against a type of insect known as the cutworm. These little pests were like something out of the Old Testament and basically destroyed any hope of the Navajo being able to feed themselves throughout the winter. In the end, Bosque Redondo, much like Tejon Farm, was an absolute failure of the first degree, one which cost the lives of thousands of Native Americans. I don't have any hard numbers on the Mescalero, but all total, somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000 Navajo would perish, either due to the long walk or the horrible conditions there at the reservation. Let that number sink in just for a moment. 3,000 to 4,000. Roughly 1 out of every 3 prisoners held at the Bosque Redondo wouldn't make it out alive. Things got so bad that in 1865, the Mescalero Apaches just left entirely, drifting down south of Ruidoso where their current reservation now stands. The Navajo would stick around, though, until finally, in June 1868, after a whole hell of a lot of unnecessary misery, they were allowed to return to their homeland at Canyon de Chelly. Of course, by that time, Kit Carson was already, well, we'll get to that soon enough. In the meantime, as I alluded to a moment ago, Carson's time as superintendent of the Bosque was relatively short-lived, just 3 months. I guess old General Carlton figured that Kit's talents could be better served elsewhere, and that elsewhere just so happened to be in the heart of Comancheria. And that's what we're going to tackle next week. Kit's foray into Comanche territory in the first battle of Adobe Walls. We'll also be bringing this series to a close next week as well, so I hope you'll join me here on Wednesday to send Kit off in style. Thank you so much for listening. Do me a favor. If this story brought any sort of value to your life, if you were entertained or educated or maybe even just temporarily distracted, please feel free to head on over to buymeacoffee.com/Wild West and buy me a coffee, or 2 or 3 or 10. Your support is very much appreciated and it helps me to keep things going here at the Wild West Extravaganza. And if you're new around these parts, welcome. Thanks for giving this little show a chance. If you're aching for more true tales from the wild and woolly West, well, you, my friend, are in luck. Just go on over to wildwestextra.com and peruse at your leisure. While you're there, hit that contact button. Let me know what's on your mind. All right, till next time, adios.